Okay, in this chapter, we're kind of extending further our discussion of the market and, in essence, why markets are so great. So, in that cheerleading philosophy of why markets are so great, and in essence, an extension of this belief of why is government intervention so bad. I'm not trying to be, certainly not trying to be political here. I'm not trying to um, make it seem like there's never a role for government. Totally is. If you remember back to chapter one, the role of the government is to ensure that when markets do fail, that the product can still be provided. As we said, things like um, police protection, fire protection, national defense, schooling, and also where the market doesn't provide enough of the product that you get that you start to have some equity concerns, right? So this would be we could think that there's a variety of reasons of why the market might not supply enough of the good. So what this chapter does is it talks more about those situations where market intervention is appropriate, and then we can extend from that situations um, where when do markets work, and when do markets work, and when does government intervention needed? I should state too for the first time here that um, the authors of the textbook are a bit conservative. I think Glenn Hubbard was on the George Bush, the first one. He was on the George Bush like economic advisors thing. So keep that in mind too. I'm not. This isn't the ultra hardcore conservative course, I'm not trying to tout his beliefs. On the other hand, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's wrong either. So let's just kind of go with that. We will be dealing with all these things. So again, we're not really crossing off any of these. Even with the appendix, we will be dealing with the appendix as well. Okay, so let's start. When we look at countries where there is chaos, for instance, in Venezuela, what we see is that there isn't enough food. Well, why is that, right? One of the reasons why, when we look at things like shortages and whatnot, is that it might be the case that no one wants to grow food or sell it. And so the question then would be like, why? Why is that the case? Why does this market fail to exist? But we can also look at it too from a situation where in some cities where they didn't allow Uber and Lyft to exist, that the taxis had this sort of like monopoly over the situation. And the lack of competition, again, can cause problems in the access to transportation for those people who don't have a car. All these are situations where allowing the market to do what it wants to do, as disruptive as it may be, at least it ensures that enough people get the thing that's needed. In this case, reliable transportation when you don't have a car, or for the Venezuelans, food supplies. And most of these situations, negative situations, occur when we try to change the price. I kind of figure if you're in the government, you generally are going to be unhappy with prices to the extent that your voters, your constituents, are unhappy with prices. And so then you'll get involved and you'll get elected by saying, I'm going to make the price lower. Well, most of the time, you might get the votes, but the voters are probably going to be disappointed Because if you just force producers to lower their prices, they're not going to want to produce it as much. Hence the Venezuelan problem. So to do all this discussion here, what we need to do is we need to look at this definition of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Let's get our drawing here. We need to look at our differences between consumer surplus and producer surplus. And what we're seeing, sorry, I just have to make sure here that we're all good here. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to make sure that the recording's still going. What our consumer and producer surplus, the surplus word, what they're trying to say here in the beginning, the surplus word is not the same as we understood surplus before, right? Surplus before was understood as having a price above the equilibrium where quantity supplied exceeded quantity demanded. That's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about basically a difference between what the price actually is and what you would have been willing to do. Remember that description I talked to you about in, what was it, last chapter? The one with the Backstreet Boys as superheroes? I am sure there's at least one of you in the class who, after seeing it and hearing about it, has ordered it on eBay. At least I hope so. I mean, for me, it was obvious. Like, it's so cool. And the price, I would have definitely paid a lot more for the complete set than I actually did. So I felt like I got a good deal. That feeling that I had of got a good deal is my consumer surplus. I would have been willing to pay more. I don't know. I would have been probably willing to pay like $30 or $35 instead of only had to pay like $5. Dude, that's a pretty big difference between what I was willing to pay and what I actually paid. So I felt like I got a good deal. So let's write that out here. But this definition here is the equivalent of saying that I felt like I got a good deal. Okay. Now, the other side to this would be for producers. So producers have a difference between the price that they actually received and the lowest price they would have been willing to accept. Now, producer surplus is not the same thing as profit, because profit takes into account the fact of like what the fixed costs are to producing the good and whatnot. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is essentially for producing one additional unit of the product, how much would it have cost them to make one additional unit of the product, and what did they actually receive? So this, I guess, in essence would be, sorry, I gotta find it. So this, in essence, would be producers feeling like they got a good deal. And so we can look at this here. Right, that each person is different. Teresa, Tom, Terry, and Tim. And they each have a highest willingness to pay. Highest price they'd be willing to pay. Teresa must really like coffee because she's willing to pay $6. Oh, sorry. Chai tea. Teresa must really like chai tea. Tim, barely cares. He's willing to pay $3. I mean, this is what's beautiful about this picture and about this schedule is that this really does pretty well accurately describe the world. I use a very simple phone. I have an iPhone, but it's like an iPhone SE, which I think is like old, ancient. Like I still have to use my finger to do the home button thing. Like I don't have the face recognition thing. Obviously, I'm not willing to pay very much for up-to-date phone technology because all I do is send some texts and call my wife. That's all I do. And I call my parents too. But I don't do very much beyond that. So I'm not willing to pay very much. My wife has the fanciest phone. It's not because she herself is fancy, it's because she has clients, she has to deal with them, she has to sometimes do pretty big financial trades using her phone and whatnot. So, she pays for the big screen. And it's funny because when she gives me her phone to do something, I'm like, oh, I don't know how to use this thing. What's it want my face for? But it's just she and I are different, right? And we each have a different willingness to pay. And the rest of the world's like that as well, right? That's why Android phones exist, because people are even unwilling to pay iPhone prices. Okay, so here's our demand curve, derived by a series of highest willingnesses to pay. Think about that. So what that would mean for us here, if I were to use my phone's example here. So here's my demand curve. Each of these points, right, so here's my wife. I don't remember how much her phone was. I think it was like $1,200 or something like that. Some fancy iPhone, right? So there she was, right? And now you could get a second phone bought because some other guy comes in there and says, I am willing to at least pay $1,000. So now at this point there would be two customers, right? You get, if the price were $1,000, then my wife phone would have a consumer surplus of $200, right? Because she was willing to pay $1,200, but she actually only had to pay $1,000. Customer 2 would have consumer surplus of 0, right? Because they were willing to pay $1,000 and they actually paid $1,000. But you can imagine now that what this demand curve, all it does is it sums up all of the opportunity costs. The opportunity cost for, what alternative, the opportunity cost would be the difference between what they were willing to sacrifice in terms of dollars for the product itself. Each of these points are what are called reservation prices, which is measuring your highest willingness to pay. Which is our definition right here. Okay. And so what that reflects as well is that price itself reflects the benefit that they're getting from it, the marginal benefit that they're getting from it. So when the price is really low, then lots of consumers will buy the product because you even will get, some people who really don't need the phone that much, but because the price is so cheap, they know they'll get some benefit from it. So as the price goes down further and further, they capture more and more of the market. And then here we see again, we can calculate this difference. Now here they're doing it as a stepwise function. You don't have to think of it like that. Let's make our life a little easier here. Let's put my supply curve here. So here would be my price as determined by the equilibrium. But what that would mean here is that this entire triangle is my consumer surplus. Adding up each of my consumers all the way to the quantity. Okay, so from there, we could actually calculate the numbers, right? Is that if this price is, again, let's just make it $100, we could calculate that difference for each consumer at each and every price. And we can solve for the area of the triangle as 1/2 base times height. Now, we would know this number right here. That would be our equilibrium quantity. We would have this number here. But to get the height of this triangle, we're going to need this number here. That would be the y-intercept of demand, which would mean I would need to set the quantity equal to 0 and solve for price, because at the y-intercept the quantity is 0. So I would be solving for this price and then taking 1/2 base times height. We'll see some numeric examples here. I just want to kind of introduce you to it earlier here. But as you can see here, again, we just add up for each consumer. We add up for the first consumer, the second consumer, the third consumer, all the way down to the market price. And we can sum all those areas up and get the total consumer surplus. So, yeah, more I can say here. But here's a better example here of what I already drew. I don't know why it took a few more slides to get there. But again, this idea is that the consumer surplus from a graphical perspective is the area below the demand curve to the price. So again, area below the demand curve. So presumably there'd be a supply curve here. And I would have my equilibrium price in right here. So this entire area would be the area below the demand curve to the equilibrium price. I'm just going to skip the apply the concept here. I guess I shouldn't actually. Let's just focus on the math here because the math is cool. Okay, so you would need, they don't really give it to us here. Why wouldn't you give it to us? Whatever, they just give us the numbers without calculating it. Whatever. I don't think this makes our life any easier. It would have been easier if they'd given us a demand function because then we could have found this, but whatever. Okay, 1/2 base times height. So the base of this triangle is right here. Is the difference between these two numbers. And then the height of the triangle is right here. It should be 111. Take 1/2 times that product, and you'll get 2.88. Producer surplus, again, not the same thing as profit. But what we're here is that we're comparing the price received to the marginal cost, the cost to produce an additional item of the product. Marginal costs are generally pretty low. Probably the starkest example of a low price would be for pharmaceutical companies, right? It might cost them less than $1 to produce a pill, one additional pill. But we obviously know that there's a significant amount of fixed costs that went into the development of the drug and all that stuff. So when people complain about, I'm not, again, trying to defend pharmaceutical companies now here, but right when we look at pharmaceutical companies and we say your pills cost, pennies and you charge $1,500, the idea is that they're not trying to capture their marginal cost. They're trying to capture their total costs, which include all of these significant fixed costs to producing a pharmaceutical drug. Marginal costs are the points that are on the supply curve, meaning, let's go back to this one here, that if we take that same description here, the supply curve is a series of marginal costs, just as the demand curve is a series of reservation prices, your highest willingnesses to pay. And so from that, what we can see is what each of these companies were willing to sell each cup of Heavenly Tea for. What was their marginal cost of producing it? And it turns out that they're making more than their marginal cost. And so what we can understand from that, again, not a difference of profit, but that there is a difference at least in what they're receiving versus the minimum price that they were willing to receive. And we can measure that difference, again, using the area of a triangle, which would be, in this case, again, 1/2 base times height. Where, again, we'd find the y-intercept for the supply function. So we would need a supply function that we could find the y-intercept for. And we would use our math with also the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price. So we would just have to find this y-intercept. And so when we put this all together, what we see is that consumer surplus is measuring this net benefit to participating in the market. And the producer surplus is also measuring this net benefit to producing in a market. But what we see, and this is where this slide becomes important, is that if I draw out this market, and I draw my demand curve, I draw my supply curve, and I say we're in a market, then here's my producer surplus, here's my consumer surplus. My producer surplus is the area above supply to the equilibrium price, and this would be my area below the demand curve to the price. What we're seeing here, and what this slide is trying to imply here, is that total surplus is maximized in a market. This total area is maximized when there's a free market and the price is freely determined. And that's essentially what we start to get described right here, is that markets are efficient, and they're efficient because, as the second point highlights, is that the consumer surplus and the producer surplus are maximized, and that these are situations of efficiency that markets are really good at doing. So everyone overall should be pretty satisfied with the market existing. And we can see that here, that the when we're at prices other than the equilibrium, then our problem is that the marginal benefit is not going to be the same as the marginal cost of producing that item. So what would generally people do? They would probably buy more of it if the marginal benefit was exceeding the marginal cost. And as they buy more, then what we would generally be seeing here is that the from the perspective of the consumer, the price would need to be lower. The price would need to fall. And producers would need to produce more stuff. And so, what we take from that is this idea that at the equilibrium, the marginal benefit to producing the item would equal the marginal cost of producing the item. And we can see these inefficient points where the market is producing either too little or too much, and that would be caused by the marginal benefit either being less than or more than the marginal cost. So there we go. We put the two together, consumer surplus and producer surplus, and we get the total economic surplus. So economic surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. And as we add them up, then it's maximized. Let's see here. Sorry, it's not working. There we go. Is that it's maximized under market conditions. That total economic surplus. And so we can calculate that out, but the problems emerge again when the market isn't allowed to be operating as it wants to. So the question would then be, like, what happens when we're not at the equilibrium quantity? Where, for instance, what if too little is made? Well, then the consumer surplus, if the price were equal to 220, then we'd have the area below the demand curve to the price. This area A would be my consumer surplus. Then we would have the producer surplus, which would be the area above the supply curve to the price, but now it's limited by this 14,000. So B and D is my producer surplus. Now the question is, what is C and E? C and E has a name. C and E is the deadweight loss. It is the loss in surplus caused by the reduced production. The fact that we're producing 1,000 less. So consumers lost B and C. B and C were given up by consumers. B got transferred from consumers to producers. Economists don't really have a great deal of problem with how the surpluses are allocated. We don't really care too much, to be honest. We generally won't get involved unless there's a deadweight loss. Deadweight loss bothers us because, again, you could have had, the surplus could have existed, but it doesn't because the market is being inefficient here. And that's what we're seeing here, an inefficient market. And so what we can see here is that under the consumer surplus, A, B, and C was the consumer surplus. D and E was the producer surplus, and there was no deadweight loss. That's why, again, economists love equilibriums. When we make the price something other than the equilibrium, you can see that the consumer surplus is reduced. The producer surplus is also going to be likely reduced, because I think D and E would be a smaller space than B and D, but we don't really know that. But we definitely know that consumers and producers each lost something that no one else captured. It's just lost. It's waste. And that's our deadweight loss. And there's a more formal definition. Deadweight loss can be thought of as the amount of inefficiency in a market. In a competitive equilibrium, deadweight loss is zero. I would agree. I'll give it a little smiley face, because it is true. But another way of looking at this is it's the cost to giving up the market, is what the deadweight loss is. So what it does for us then is it forces us to look at economic efficiency. So efficiency then comes from the fact that the marginal cost of producing that item is equal to the marginal benefit that consumers get to enjoy of that item. So markets produce this. So markets produce this economic efficiency. And this would be the point where the marginal benefits equal the marginal cost for production and consumption of the item. And we've got maximized consumer surplus as well as producer surplus under these market conditions. Now, one of the reasons for this chapter is going to be a pretty strong position against price controls. In general, economists generally agree that price controls are bad. As I kind of said here, it's a difference between what I can suggest as public policy with the idea in mind that I am not a politician. I don't have to be voted in for anything. So if I don't have to be voted in for anything, then it doesn't matter, what I believe about the world. So, right? I'm just gonna go with what I got here. I'm just going to allow there to exist. I'm just going to say that price controls are bad. But if I had to be voted in for something, I'm going to get voted in for something by saying to you, all you voters, that things are bad, that prices are too high, or that wages are too low, and that I think that it's so wrong that I'm going to force the price to be something more fair. Well, there's where our problems start to emerge. So we see these with minimum wages. We see them with rent controls. We saw them on Maui, for instance, after the fires, where the government said that you can only charge certain prices for things. It makes you look good. It really does. Absolutely, I cannot fault politicians for calling for them. But what I'm hoping you would see, at least from the last few slides, is that in the long run, we all suffer from it. And we all suffer from it because it is going to create deadweight losses. And so that's what we see here on our is that they create deadweight losses. And there's two types of laws that you can make. One, where you can say that the maximum price can't go any higher than this. And another one, which is called the price floor, where you set the minimum price. You would use a different kind of law based on a different objective, right? Typically, when we're talking about the minimum wage, we're generally talking about a price floor because we want people to get a certain minimum wage, minimum price for their labor that they're selling. When we're talking about rent controls, we're generally talking about people shouldn't have to pay any higher than a certain price. So depending on what kind of social goal you have here, you're going to see that the type of law that we need to enforce it is going to be different. Agricultural price supports. These are what we ensure that farmers receive for growing products. And so most of the time there, what we're saying is that farmers should receive a minimum amount for whatever they're growing. And so here, the wheat market. Like, who's against the farmer? Like, everyone loves farmers, probably. And I'm a bit preferential. I'm from the Midwest originally, so farming is in my genes, I suppose. But, with that said, what that means is that if we get the vote of the farmer and say prices should be $8 for corn or soybeans or wheat in this case, then again, you're limiting what the consumer is going to receive as their surplus. You're going to enhance what producers are going to get as their surplus, right? Which is kind of the idea. You wanted farmers to feel happy about it. So consumers clearly lost out because their surplus is going down. So we as consumers are going to have to pay higher prices for food. Farmers are going to be enriched by receiving higher prices for their crops. And we all lose out because the deadweight loss exists. And the situation can get worse then too, is that at that surplus, what you see at that price of $8, that a surplus exists, a general surplus. That there's so here's my quantity demanded point, and here's my quantity supplied point. So farmers would be growing 2.2 billion bushels, but consumers would only buy 1.8. So farmers get $8 for selling 1.8. I don't know, let's do the math here. So if they get $8 a bushel for selling 8 billion, let's just do the, so they would get a total of $14.4 billion. In the old school world, they were getting $6.50 and they were selling 2. So they were obviously making a little bit less here. But the problem is, look at this, there's 0.4 that isn't bought, which is wasted. The problem can get worse because typically what happens is that the government intervenes and buys that extra 0.4. So even more people are losing out here. So the consumer is losing out because they're having to pay $8 for their wheat rather than $6.50. And the government's losing out because they're going to probably buy that difference. So they're going to lose 3.2 because they're going to lose 8 times 0.4. Maybe poor people will benefit though, because usually what happens is that the government buys the excess and then turns it into food. But generally speaking, the food is pretty bad tasting. As an aside here, I remember when my parents lost their jobs in like the 1980 recession, and I remember there was no food in the house, and we had to go, and like the government makes stuff. Oh, it's horrible. And like the can looks like, yeah, this is what the can looked like right here. It's just like a white can with like some peanuts on it and stuff. And they also made cheese. Oh, look at this. Beef with juices. So, right, I mean, the story here is that the government's got all this beef, and I guess they're just throwing it in a can and adding some juice and giving it to poor people. It really sucks, and it really doesn't taste good. Oh yeah, the government cheese too. God, I remember that stuff. No, that's a nice way to say it. Government surplus food was an acquired taste. It is true. It was an acquired taste. Okay, so right, but you're getting the idea here is that you're by setting the price something other than $6.50, the government in this case is now deciding who the winners and losers are. And again, I'm not against the farmer, and that's not what I'm trying to say here. I think I'm more just against the idea that the winners and losers are being determined by something other than the market. Right? Unless you're really in power and you want to protect yourself in power, generally speaking, we want the market conditions to prevail to ensure things. The other example of where we see this is with the minimum wage. The last time the minimum wage was changed was actually during the Obama administration in 2009. Many of you weren't that old at that point. And so the federal minimum wage remains $7.25 an hour. Most cities and states have a minimum wage above that. Let's just look here. Let's just look at let's look at the Wikipedia entry map. So it looks like some states have kept the $7.25 an hour. Here in Hawaii, we have 14. You've got California at 16, New York at 15, Massachusetts at 15, and then you have a bunch at 7.25. Well, again, any of these, even the 7.25, the problem with all of these numbers is that it's artificial. It's operating outside of the market. So when we look at this, right, the minimum wage is a price floor. So in this price floor, this would be our law. That states that the wage can go no lower than a certain amount. So in essence, what we would do here is we'd say this is where 7.25 is. And the problem would be is that there are more workers who want to work at that wage than firms want them. So it's going to cause some unemployment. So you're going to have some people who are unemployed because there's not enough jobs for them at $7.25 an hour. Now, in general, remember the worker is the supplier because they're the ones supplying their labor. The producer surplus does go up. Right, so here's our producer surplus. It is going up. And it would explain why businesses are generally against it, because they are the consumers, and so consumer surplus is going down. But again, it does create this deadweight loss. And I neither own a business, nor do I work at the minimum wage, to be honest. I mean, I have worked at the minimum wage, and I think I got $4.25 an hour when I worked the minimum wage. Oh, it sucked as a job. But as an older man now, I can look at this minimum wage, and my only critique against it is the arbitrary nature of the $7.25. I just would like to see some data. If we're going to endure all this pain from having a minimum wage and causing all this deadweight loss, there should be a statement of why the wage is what it needs to be. And so, you know, we've done, this is actually a pretty famous study here of Card and Kruger, but this study at this point is 30 years old. We just had on the previous slide, it talked about the idea that minimum wage generally causes unemployment. So what Card and Kruger did is they found a place, like a street, where on one side of the road it was the state of New Jersey, and on the other side of the road it was the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And New Jersey had raised its minimum wage, but the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had not. And so the question would be is, what happened to employment? And what they actually curiously found is that even though New Jersey had raised its minimum wage, New Jersey actually got more workers rather than fewer. So there was not more unemployment despite the increase in the minimum wage. And they did some interviews, if my memory is correct here. And in the interviews they did, the employers weren't happy about it, but they just said, well, you know what? I just have to pay the wage. What am I going to do? Have robots take their orders? I just have to pay it. So this study has been largely cited by probably lots of other states as to why they're increasing their wages, the minimum wage, and they're not too worried about the counter argument that they're causing unemployment. Now, the rent ceiling, as opposed to a price floor, so a price ceiling, rather than stating the maximum, or sorry, the minimum price, the price ceiling is stating the maximum price. So effective price ceilings are generally below, not generally, they are below the equilibrium. So price floors are above the equilibrium, price ceilings are below the equilibrium. And what we're seeing here is that this would be a rent control. So we'd say, oh, the equilibrium rental rate is $2,500, but the law says it can't go any higher than $1,500. The problem with this, again, would be that the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. Which would mean that the consequence here now is that we have a shortage of housing. And additionally, that the quality of the housing that's provided at 15, the quality might be low as well. So we'd have low quality and not enough of it. But again, same kind of discussion here, right? So we like this here. And we could see that the producer surplus would now be this small triangle. The consumer surplus would be this, was that trapezoid? I don't know what that is. But again, we still have our deadweight loss right here. And again, what would be the shedding critique? Shedding critique would be, how'd you come up with 1,500? Tell me what it is that made you think that that should be the ceiling price rather than it just being a nice convenient number. In other words, why go through all the pain of doing this if you're not going to tell us why it should be what it should be? So again, producer surplus is reduced, consumer surplus is increased, which is, I guess, your whole point because you're trying to get more votes by imposing this rent ceiling. But you do have the deadweight loss. And you do have this shortage of apartments, meaning you have homeless people now. And generally what happens when you impose these price controls, the consequence of price controls is illegal activity. So in other words, what we see is that why wouldn't a landlord then just say, well, let's not do a lease, just pay me in cash? Or if we even look at it from the minimum wage, oh, you don't have documentation, you're not a legal worker? Well, that's fine because I didn't want to pay you the minimum wage anyway. How about I pay you $100 cash? Then you don't have to pay any taxes and I don't have to pay you the minimum wage. Win, win, win. Well, yes. I mean, I guess Scheiding would favor it because it is the market, being allowed to be the market. But the problem would be is that now we could imagine that the workplace is a little bit less safe because now you've got undocumented workers, meaning workers who might not be able to enjoy all the safety that comes from, having workplace compensation, workers' compensation, from having Social Security. And if you're a landlord or you're a renter, a tenant, right, you've now lost the ability to have a lease, which could protect you if your landlord becomes a dick or something. So things moving to be an illegal activity to work around price controls generally does not work out well for us as consumers. And again, this is I'm just going to add it here just because I really feel this. Scheiding critique number 1, which isn't just me, it's really just most economists. I'm going to put it very simply to you. Is who decides this? I just don't like the idea of people deciding who the winners and losers should be. it just gets really messy really fast, and it tends to favor some groups of the population over others in an unfair way. And if you're not part of the club or the group, then you might find yourself having to pay more, whereas those who are part of the group can set up, a government where, those with power stay in power and even get more power. It just, it makes me skeptical of like what's going on here. And even if it did none of those things, or even if you were okay with any of those things, you'd still have this critique here, which is that it reduces economic efficiency. And I'm going to add number 3 here. Is how do you determine what that arbitrary amount should be? Why should the minimum wage be $7.25? What is your data? What are your facts that led you to believing that? So these are 3. I shouldn't have just said Scheidting critique. I just should have said any economist's critique of price controls. Why economists generally dislike price controls is that we don't like the idea of someone else picking winners and losers. We don't like the idea of the deadweight loss. And we don't like the idea that the prices are determined by something other than the market, in some sense arbitrarily. We certainly saw this on COVID-19. There was this famous example here. I mean, don't you kind of remember this era? There was this guy, I think it was in like Kentucky or Tennessee, and he bought like 17,700 bottles of hand sanitizer. He saw that there was going to be this problem. I don't have to log. I do have a New York Times account. I just don't want to log in. Okay, we'll just presume here we can see beyond this. But that guy, he looks like a nice guy, right? He had an Amazon business, and he went around, as soon as he realized there was going to be this pandemic, he drove around to like Dollar Generals and Walmarts and whatever, all around Tennessee and Kentucky, and bought had a big U-Haul truck, and he just started loading it with hand sanitizer. Then he went on Amazon and just set the price. Well, he ended up accumulating 17,700 bottles of hand sanitizer. And I'm guessing here, right, is that they've been fined. Looks like Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, in one case, one seller charged $80 to $130 for 2-liter bottles of Purell, which usually go for $20 to $35. So the government basically just said, okay, you shouldn't be charging these really high prices because it's an emergency, so you have to make sure that you pay no more than this certain price. Probably makes the government really happy, makes voters really happy with the government, that they're protecting the people. The problem is that it's not going to be available. So if you then can't charge what the market would bear, meaning this really high price, if you're not allowed to charge $130 for hand sanitizer, then there's just going to be an empty store shelf. Right? And I'm sure we all see this, right? Like, we all have those pictures. I mean, I remember going to Target in March of 2020, and it was impossible to buy hand sanitizer, disinfectant wipes, the Clorox wipes, and toilet paper. Had I been allowed to just pay whatever price I wanted to, I probably would have been able to get it. But I couldn't. So, again, we had the Maui fires where the same thing was happening with like generators and whatnot. It makes you look really good if you're a politician. It's just that the problem is that you're not going to have enough of the stuff out there. And the only people that are going to get the product are the ones that are lucky enough to have been first in line to get it first. I don't know. It bothers me. And the reason why it bothers me is not because I wasn't first, although I wasn't, but it bothers me again because it stops producers from being able to profit in a bad situation. Why we want them to be able to profit from that is because that would have then caused them to try to stockpile things before the pandemic really took the worst part of it. Why would they want to make more hand sanitizer if they're going to be stuck selling it for $3.99 when they could have sold it for $9.99? Like, why would they want to do that? Well, it's fine. You're going to limit me to $3.99 price? Well, then fine. I'm just going to make this small amount. Right? And so that same quantity exists at both prices, but the difference, and here's the key point here, is that the difference is that the person buying it for $9.99 really needs it and is willing to pay that high price. Maybe they work at a doctor's office, maybe they work at a school, but there's some reason why they need it, and they're willing to pay that price that's more than double what the normal price is. But when the price is just forced to be set at $3.99, that person who really needs it and would have been willing to pay more, if they're not first in line, they don't get it. The market would have sorted this out more properly and said, it doesn't matter whether you're first in line or last. Are you willing to pay the $9.99 price? Then that person would have gotten the item. And so that's what we kind of basically get here in this description, is that in general, most economists are opposed to government intervention, even during an emergency with price gouging, because what it generally tends to do is cause a significant shortage, which isn't exactly what you want to have happen. You want the people who are willing to pay the high price for it be the ones who are willing to get it. Now, eventually, right, the price does go up, and the price does go up because, right, the emergency is done. But by then, right, the demand is already shifted out because of whatever this emergency was. But eventually, the supply curve becomes upward sloping and not completely vertical, because now the price gouging law allows people to capture additional prices, additional costs. And now we get into, when I said my critiques of price controls, those were all positive statements, meaning statements of truth or falsehoods, I guess. And I was saying statements that could be tested true or false, that economists, myself included, are generally against price controls because they reduce efficiency, because they create deadweight losses, and because they create a situation where some other entity, some other agency is getting to determine who the winners and losers are. But despite what I think in terms of economic efficiency and the fact of the matter that they decrease economic efficiency, we still have them. Price controls are all around. So now this comes into a normative analysis, again, of what we think is right versus wrong, or what ought to be. And I am not your expert on that. I am just a lowly professor of economics. So I would have no idea how things ought to be. Now, the same discussion of the government intervening in the market by imposing price controls, we can do that same analysis by looking at taxes. And we could look at what happens when the government decides to tax things. There'd be two ways that they can tax things. They can have a per unit tax, or they could have an ad valorem tax, or a percentage tax. So, right, typically our sales tax, right, which is 4.5% here in Hawaii, is a percentage tax, right? Or sorry, I shouldn't say sales tax, it's our general excise tax. Per unit tax would be like the 5 cents we pay per bottle or can here in the state. The government also imposes an excise tax on gas, 18.4 cents a gallon. Just another example of a tax. So what do these taxes do? What these taxes do is they shift the curve. They shift the curve of who has to pay the tax. So you're going to shift the curve of who's legally responsible for paying the tax. Meaning, in other words, for instance, here in Hawaii, we pay a general excise tax for all the groceries, for instance, that we buy. But if I buy my groceries at Safeway and Safeway doesn't pay the tax, the government's not going to come after me, right? I paid it to Safeway. Safeway is just the one that didn't give it to the government. Safeway is the one that's legally responsible for paying the tax. So in this case, we would shift the supply curve. Now here, where there's a parallel shift, you're going to see that with the unit tax. In this case, cigarettes at $6 a pack. Actually, Hawaii has one of the highest tax rates for cigarettes. What is this? $3.20 cigarette excise tax rate. Which I think is about as high as Hawaii. As high as New York State, sorry. Let's look at our map of. Looks like the same person made this that made the minimum wage one. Okay, well, let's make it bigger here. Yeah, ours is 320. Whoa, New York is 535. Jeez. Yeah, so ours is, I thought ours used to be the highest. No, it's not. Puerto Rico is higher. New York State is higher. DC is higher. Maryland's higher. Yeah, but look at Missouri. 17 cents. I guess Missouri wants you to smoke. North Carolina, 45 cents. Yeah, jeez. 17 cents. Why even bother imposing a tax? It makes sense, though. I used to live in St. Louis and I did smoke, so I guess taxes do cause us to do different things. But here, right, we would shift this up. In this case, you can see that we're shifting it up by $1 here. So that would be like from here to here would be $7, from $6 to $7. But what we can see is that there's a difference. So the legal responsibility is $1. And this is a binary condition, meaning either the consumer is responsible for paying the tax or the producer is responsible for paying the tax, one or the other. Economists generally care more about the economic incidence of the tax. And here, what we're going to see is that there's sharing of the tax. So it's not often the case that even though there's a 4.5% GET tax for me as a consumer, I'm not paying the whole 4.5%. I mean, I am, but there's some sharing going on. And that's what we need to see here over the next few slides. Okay, so I parallel shifted upward the supply curve by $1. So a higher tax shifts the supply curve to the left, and it's going to shift it by exactly $1. But what we see is that the equilibrium price only went up from $6 to $6.90. So how much would that mean consumers are now paying extra? 90 cents. They're not paying $1 more, they're paying 90 cents more. Meaning that they're covering about 90% of this $1 tax. And that's what we start to see here. That producers Then from $6.90, you subtract the dollar and you get $5.90. So producers used to get $6, now they get $5.90. Consumers used to pay $6, now they have to pay $6.90. So producers are paying about 10 cents of this tax, consumers are paying about 90 cents of this tax. What determines the economic incidence is the term that we haven't really discussed yet. There's something called the elasticity, my willingness to pay for the product. For people who smoke, they are willing to pay really high prices because they have an addiction to tobacco. And so because of that, we can impose more of the tax on them because they'll just keep paying it because they want the product so badly. And you can generally see elasticity by looking at the relative steepness of the curves. And you can see that this demand curve is relatively steep, as we would expect for cigarettes, meaning that you raise the price and you really don't lose that much demand. So consumers are just going to pay most of the tax. So what do we see here? When demand is really steep, consumers pay most of the tax. And that's what we see here. So the government will get that $1 times the quantity sold. So that's our tax revenue. And look at the yellow region. That's right. There's a deadweight loss caused by the fact that now we are producing less cigarettes. That deadweight loss would be a loss in efficiency. Now, the government has a stronger case for this because there's such huge negative health consequences to smoking that we actually want fewer people to smoke. So this isn't the bad thing from their perspective that there is a deadweight loss. But all the same, there still is a deadweight loss. In public finance, we do talk about this deadweight loss quite a bit, and we talk about that as an excess burden. And what we're trying to do is make the excess burden as small as possible. So generally speaking, we talk about ways in which to make the tax more efficient, to reduce the total deadweight loss as much as possible. So that might mean that for some things we use a percentage tax, for other things we use a unit tax, and you would try to do that. You would try to pick one or the other in a way that reduces the total deadweight loss. So here we have gasoline also with a pretty relatively steep demand curve, reflecting the fact that it doesn't have a lot of elasticity. And we can see that we're shifting the supply curve because of this tax that's being imposed. But again, the consumer is not going to pay for the whole amount of the tax. It's going to be shared by consumers and producers. And here we can see it here, that with this 10-cent tax, the new equilibrium price is $2.58. So consumers are in essence going to pay 8 of the 10 cents. Then you drop down by 10 cents from the $2.58 price down to $2.48. Producers are now going to be receiving 2 cents less than they used to. And the government's going to capture all of this as revenue. So that's all my government revenue. But again, I'm going to have this deadweight loss, which again, if you're an environmentalist, might be good that people are driving less. But actually, if you also care about infrastructure, this is a bad thing because it means that fewer people are going to be driving and using gas. So I might lose some money as well. So this again goes back to this idea of the tax incidence. This economic incidence is who actually is paying the tax, that division of the tax burden between the two. So we've already been kind of talking about this before we even got to this slide. So legal obligation to pay the tax, legal incidence is not the same as economic incidence of the tax. So with that difference between the two, it all depends on how badly certain people need things. And again, that goes back to the idea of elasticity. Even though the gas station is responsible for giving the tax to the government, it's still going to be shared between the buyers and the sellers, depending on their relative elasticities. I use the economic term elasticity. The author of the textbook, realizing that they didn't use that term yet or introduce that term yet, they had to talk about the demand curve either being steep or relatively flat. So basically what this is saying is that when the demand is steeper, they pay most of the tax. Not all of it, but most of it. And when it's flatter, sellers pay most of the tax. This is actually a pretty good example here as well. So if you've ever looked at your paycheck for something, you'll notice your FICA contributions, which is it's a tax that's used to pay for Social Security and Medicare. The employer pays half and workers pay half. So it makes it seem like you're getting a nice, half of your retirement's being paid for by your employer, and that I, as the worker, am paying for the other half. But it turns out that because of the relative elasticities, that the if Social Security didn't exist, employers would just have to pay. Employers would have to decide how much of this tax they're going to essentially pay. It's going to depend on what kind of labor it is. It turns out that if we didn't have this tax imposed, employers would just be paying us that extra amount. So in other words, we as workers are, for the most part, paying the entire 15.3% rather than just 7.65%. Because it turns out that workers have a really steep supply curve and that the demand curve is much flatter. And so because us as the suppliers of labor, because our supply curve is so steep, we pay most of the tax. And that's what we're seeing here. We see a supply curve that's really, really steep, and so we pay most of the tax. Which kind of sucks, because if Social Security ends up not existing when I'm old, and certainly wouldn't exist when you're old enough, that would be money that we all wasted and went nowhere. Okay, in these final slides, we want to add some, this now goes to the appendix to chapter 4, which again is important for you to do. What this does is it starts to introduce this idea that we can quantify the curves. So we can solve for equilibrium by setting these two equations equal to each other. So what we would do is set equal to each other, and then we would solve for P. And that's what we would see here. So that we could find the price here of 2,500, and then we can substitute that into either the supply function or the demand function to find the quantity. So now I would substitute in that $2,500 as we're doing here to solve for the quantities. And what that does is it gives me now the actual numbers of where things are. And yes, we can insert that on a supply and demand graph like they did right here. And we can also find the y-intercepts of the curves. And we do that by setting the equation equal to 0. And we can solve for these, and these are going to be the y-intercepts of these curves. Why would you do all that work? Because now I can find my consumer surplus, and now I can find my producer surplus. With, again, the area of the triangle, which would be 1/2 base times height. Doesn't matter what you think is the base or what you consider the height, because that's all your perspective on things. And that's what we would see here, where I take 1/2 base times the height and solve, and this the label here would be dollars. And what that would mean as well is that we can then calculate, after we've gone that far, what we can do is calculate the difference of what happens when we impose a price control. So we would first find the equilibrium price and quantity, which we had solved in the previous slides. We'd find the y-intercepts of both curves, which we found already. So we basically already found this number, we found this number, we found this number, that number and that number. And then what we would say is, okay, the government has imposed a price control of $1,500. Well, then insert that $1,500 into the equations to find the quantities. So here's my quantity supplied at 1,500. And at 1,500, right, that 950,000, that's that price right there. And now I'm going to take that 950,000 quantity, right? I already know this, but now I need to find this. So I'm going to substitute it into the demand function, which is what I do here, to find that $3,800 price here. And this one was given. Now I've got enough numbers to solve for everything, because this right here is going to be my consumer surplus. Sorry, this. Sorry about that. This right here is going to be my consumer surplus. That little triangle right down there is my producer surplus. And this right here is my deadweight loss. Now I can solve for all these things. Deadweight loss triangle is going to be 1/2 base times height. Producer surplus is going to be 1/2 base times height. Consumer surplus is going to be a square plus a triangle, so that would be length times width plus 1/2 base times height. And that's what we're seeing here. And right here. And right there. And there you go. So we can now calculate and actually put real numbers between what the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss would be in a free market versus in one where there are price controls. And it's these numbers right here that is used as the basis for why economists are generally opposed to really any price controls. Is that you both have a significant deadweight loss and you have the government picking who the winners and losers are. Okay.